Who am I? You sure you want to know? This story of mine is not for the faint of heart. If somebody told you this was a happy little tale, that I was just your average ordinary guy not a care in the world, somebody lied. This movie is so iconic. God, I love this movie so much. Like, I owned this movie on VHS, but to be fair, I'm not that old. This was in the stage where VHS was slowly dying out, but still, I owned this movie on VHS, and I used to watch this movie so much that, like, I wore out the tape because that's how many times I watched this movie. Like, God, I love this movie so much. So no matter what I say, negative, positive, whatever, just to let you guys know that all the problems and nitpicks I bring up, they're all done out of love. I love this movie so much. Like, regardless of all its flaws, this is a great movie. Spider-Man is directed by Sam Raimi and stars Tobey Maguire as the wall-crawling, web-spinning webhead, Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson, James Franco as Harry Osborn, Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn / the Green Goblin, as well as many others. The only way I can describe Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is that it is an iconic superhero film. In many ways, this is the definitive superhero origin film. This, alongside with Superman the movie, really just set the bar of what a superhero movie could be, especially with the origin story itself. Like, you look at the superhero movies that have come out within the past 20 years, and they've all been influenced and inspired by Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. People may say that Zack Snyder is the blueprint. I think Sam Raimi is the blueprint, because you look at the way this film is structured, and you can see this being the template for many of the superhero films we've gotten within the past 20 years. And I mean, this is what happens when you get a talented director who is also a fan of the source material, who respects it, who loves it, who's grown up with it, and to me, that's when you get the best of both worlds. You feel Sam Raimi's passion for those Stan Lee and Steve Ditko comics. You feel Sam Raimi's creative flair behind the camera. I mean, not only do you get the vibes through the little Easter eggs and references and visual cues, but also in the storytelling. That sincere yet campy tone is very much in line with those Stan Lee and Steve Ditko comics. Like, in many ways, Sam Raimi captures that tone and translates it into the film form so wonderfully. Also, before we go any further, I have to mention that one of the extra levels of enjoyment with the Sam Raimi films is the memes. Those memes have added an extra layer of enjoyment on top of everything. So, like the Star Wars prequels, because they've been memed to absolute oblivion, like, there's just that extra layer of fun and enjoyment. In many ways, when you sit down and watch these movies and you hear things like, you know, I'm something of a scientist myself, you just can't help but get the memes out of your head, so you just smile when you hear those lines. Now, the reason why I call this film the definitive superhero origin film is because this film essentially does the origin from Amazing Fantasy 15 almost perfectly. I love the way Sam Raimi does the spider bite. I love the way he does the wrestling match. I mean, you got Macho Man Randy Savage as Bonesaw. I love that random guy who just screams, "Cage!" I love Bruce Campbell's cameo as the wrestling match host. I mean, when he's like, "Who? The deadly, the terrifying, the amazing Spider-Man!" I love the moment where Peter gets cheated and lets the robber go.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
And of course, I love the scene where Peter witnesses Ben's death. Like, just, "I'm here, Uncle Ben. Peter. God, it's so wonderfully performed. I mean, yes, people take the piss out of Tobey Maguire's crying face. I mean, I do. It's funny, but also it is so pure and authentic that just, like, it adds to the scene. I mean, yes, take it out of context and turn it into memes, whatever, but in context of the film, it is pure and genuine and just, it adds to the moment. It's wonderful. In many ways, this film's interpretation of the origin is so iconic that people forget that that's not how Uncle Ben dies. Uncle Ben doesn't die in the streets looking for Peter. In the comics, he dies when a burglar breaks into their house and kills him. It's kind of funny how things like this work, you know, something becomes so iconic that it just becomes the norm. It's actually kind of similar to the Black Suit and Venom, where in the comics, the Black Suit just made Peter tired, but it was actually the 90s show that sort of made the symbiote add that extra level to where the symbiote used to make Peter really angry and heighten his anger and strength. Now, I did say this movie does the origin almost perfectly, and to me, I say that because there's a little bit of a black spot on the origin, and that is the moment where Peter lets the robber die. To me, that moment doesn't really sit well with me, especially since in the comic books, it's meant to be a moment where Peter realizes that revenge is futile and he has to save the robber to, you know, make sure that he isn't a murderer or he isn't involved in some sort of dark, twisted, you know, origin story. Instead, it's a moment of purity. It's where good triumphs over evil. But here in the Sam Raimi film, Peter just watches the burglar fall out the window and looks down at his dead body, and there's this weird, like, ominous look on his face that doesn't sit right with me. But I mean, aside from that, I think Sam Raimi does the origin perfectly, and it's wonderful, and just, I love the Spider-Man origin story. I know people are just like, oh, I'm so sick of seeing it. I love it. I think it's a really great story about growth and revenge and tragedy. I think it's wonderful, to be honest. Damn, I keep saying the word wonderful. I don't know why. Like, if I'm talking about Spider-Man thing, normally I'd be saying amazing, but for some reason I'm saying wonderful today. One scene I have to mention that I love is when Peter comes home from graduation, and then he goes into his room and he opens the trunk, and he pulls out the drawing of the Spider-Man costume with Danny Elfman's responsibility theme playing in the background, and then Uncle Ben's voiceover going, with great power comes great responsibility. Just... God, that's cinema right there. Now let's get on to the cast for this film. Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker / Spider-Man. Okay, this is going to be an interesting one because I love Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man. In many ways, he is one of like the first introductions to the character I had, and I really like Tobey in the role, but I will not say he is perfect. In many ways, there are a couple of issues I have with him. That mainly being his Peter Parker, whilst being, you know, a nice guy and naive and fun and all that, there's just something about him that is just weird. And in many ways, there are times where he comes across like a victim. Like, in the scenes with J. Jonah Jameson, Peter kind of just sits there taking all of J. Jonah's shit. And then you compare him to the Peter Parker in the comics, and to me, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker has given the biggest misconception to general audiences, and that is, Peter Parker is kind of a pushover, and he's kind of passive, and he's kind of dorky and dweeby, and to me, that's not the case. And to me, when it comes to my personal interpretation of Peter Parker, when it comes to the Peter Parker in the comic books, Tobey Maguire is just too passive. Like, in the comics, whenever J. Jonah Jameson throws Peter under the bus or swindles him in some way, Peter will normally have a sarcastic remark to throw back at J. Jonah Jameson. But when you look at Tobey's, he kind of just sits there and takes it and just looks like a bit of a doofus. Like, one of the key things about Peter Parker in the comics is that he isn't a pushover and he will snap back when he needs to. And that's kind of my problem with Tobey Maguire. He kind of just takes people's shit and doesn't ever really retaliate in a fun, light-hearted, sarcastic way, you know, saying quips. He doesn't really do that. He just stands there and takes it, or he just stands there and looks like a dweeb. It's funny, actually. In many ways, Tobey Maguire is like the character that feels the most out of place, because in many ways, Sam Raimi tells him to play it like he is a kid from the 60s, but has been put into, you know, modern day. I say modern day, it's like the 90s and early 2000s. But then there's also that weird timeless quality with the Raimi films, but still, in many ways, Tobey Maguire seems kind of off compared to the rest of the cast. Again, that's not to say that I hate him or dislike him, no. I really like Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker and as Spider-Man. And to be honest, there's a big misconception around that Tobey never really quips. I mean, yes, he does. I remember back in the day when the Amazing Spider-Man films used to come out, and I had a bunch of recency bias being like, no, Tobey Maguire sucks, Andrew Garfield's the best, Andrew Garfield quips and Tobey never did. I mean, that's just a bold-faced lie. Having grown up now and realizing that it's okay to point out the pros and cons of other, you know, things and enjoy what they, you know, all represent, I realize now that Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man does quip and does joke. But my problem with his quips and jokes is that I'm not a fan of Tobey Maguire's line delivery. In many ways, they seem a bit stilted and forced, and they don't feel genuine.
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
Especially compared to his Peter Parker, because in most comic representations, Peter Parker, normally when he's at home, you know, in private with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, he's normally quite talkative and quite quippy. So you buy that when he's in the costume, he starts spewing out all the jokes. But because Tobey Maguire's Peter is so kind of like reserved and like keeps to himself and is so like stuck in his own shell, you don't buy it when he starts making all these quips. But I mean, aside from that, I think Tobey Maguire is really good in the role. He's a really good actor. I mean, he does his job very well, and he is a good Spider-Man. Now we get on to Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson, and oh boy. No, I like Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane. I like her character the most in this film. Throughout the trilogy, she becomes more and more unlikable. But in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man film, I like her a lot. And in terms of for the characters we get in the film, I like Mary Jane's character arc in this film. I like that she learns to accept herself and believe in herself. And one of the reasons why she is able to do that is because of Peter's support for her. And so ultimately, by the end of the film, she falls in love with him. And you honestly buy that for the character. I think it's a really nice arc, and especially the scene where Peter has to reject her, and then you feel her pain. And for the most part, we know that Peter loves her, and he wants her more than anything, and she loves him too. But then because of his responsibility, he pushes her away, and so when she's in pain, you feel her pain. It's really tragic. I love it. My problem with Mary Jane in this movie is she's a bit too reserved, a bit too unsure of herself, and she isn't the confident, flirty, fearsome character that we get in the comics. I mean, yes, she has all these insecurities in the comics. She comes from that abusive household. But Mary Jane in the comics is able to mask that with her fun, bubbly party girl personality. But we don't really get that in this film. And I don't know whether to blame Kirsten Dunst or the script, but there are just moments where Mary Jane doesn't act like Mary Jane. Like, a big example of this actually is during the Thanksgiving parade when Harry tries to kiss her and she brushes it off. Comic book Mary Jane would play that off with like a little comment just being like, oh, easy tiger or something like that. But that's not what she does. Instead, she kind of just like pauses and it looks kind of like really shallow on her end, just like, no. I'm only with Harry because of his money. Like, in many ways, that's kind of how it plays. And I know that's sort of a thing from the comics, like Mary Jane, like, on and off dates Harry for a bit before she goes with Peter. But it's, I don't know, the way it plays in the movie doesn't feel as organic as it does in the comics. So again, to reiterate, I don't think Kirsten Dunst is a bad Mary Jane, and in fact, I like the character of Mary Jane in this first film. But when I compare it to the comics, and I'm comparing it to the comics because the character in the comics is awesome, and I want to see that, you know, represented on screen, I just think Kirsten Dunst doesn't live up to that expectation. But again, that's no slight on the character in this film. I like her story. Now getting onto the film's major highlight, and that is Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin. Just
Hello, my dear.
I love him so much. His performance is wonderful. I mean, just, he is so, like, beautifully villainous and hammy and over the top, but he's also just such a wonderful representation of the Green Goblin. Like, in many ways, he brings that character to life. He's definitely in my top 3 interpretations of the character. He's probably in the number 2 spot, because my favorite is the 90s cartoon. I mean, that's just because I love the design of the Goblin in the 90s cartoon. I love the higher pitched voice, Parker! I'm not the Hobgoblin, meddler, I'm the Green Goblin! Yeah, I love the 90s animated series Green Goblin, but Willem Dafoe is a very close second to me. He's amazing. And I know people don't really like the costume. I actually quite like the costume in this film. And this is an unpopular opinion. Most people like it when, you know, the mask is slowly removed and you can see his eyes and you can see his mouth. To me, that's actually when the costume doesn't work for me. To me, the costume looks at its best when you can see the yellow eyes and you can't see Defoe's mouth moving, you know, underneath the mask. To me, whenever he starts peeling back the eyes and you can see his mouth through the mask, that's when the mask, to me, looks really cheap. If anything, I think the costume works better when it's all covered up, when you can't see Defoe's eyes and when you can't see his mouth. To me, that's when the costume looks much better. I will say my major story gripe with the Goblin is that he manages to accomplish his villainous goal quite early on in the film. Like, he manages to kill the board of directors during the Thanksgiving parade, and that's kind of it. After that, he's kind of just flying around trolling Spider-Man just for the lols. I don't know, it feels a bit flat. Like, I think if Spider-Man had thwarted him multiple times and then Green Goblin gets the idea of, oh, we can either turn Spider-Man or we have to kill him, to me that change would make it feel a bit more organic, because instead it's just, oh, Spider-Man beats him and he's just like, there's one person that will challenge us, let's go turn him to the dark side. It feels incomplete.
You know how much I sacrificed?
But other than that, I don't really have anything else negative to say about Dafoe as the Green Goblin. He's just perfect. Out am I?
Out am I?
We've also got James Franco as Harry Osborn, and I think James Franco does a good job. I think he does a good job as Harry Osborn. I wouldn't say Harry is the most fleshed out character in this movie. I mean, you get elements of comic book Harry Osborn in this film. You know, he's looking for his father's approval. He isn't really going anywhere in terms of his life. Like, he isn't the smartest. He needs Peter's help, that kind of stuff. To me, his relationship with Mary Jane in the film feels a little bit shallow, and it isn't as dived into as deeply as it is in the comics, because in the comics, he really wants to be with Mary Jane, because in many ways, comic book Harry Osborn has this inferiority complex of just like, oh, I want what Peter has, or I want this, and I want that. And to me, James Franco's Harry Osborn in the film doesn't really get to do that. But still, he's really good in the film, and I like seeing him. And then, of course, we have the iconic casting of J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. I mean, he is just perfection. He is that character ripped straight off the page and put onto the screen. His comedic timing, his line delivery, the voice, the mannerisms, it's all just amazing. Even down to the little details, like Jameson having a sense of integrity. When Goblin asks him who takes the pictures of Spider-Man, and he lies in saying he doesn't know who he is, that is brilliant character stuff taken from the comics that Raimi effectively puts onto the screen. Plus, just also, J.K. Simmons is just the best in this role. Not a job, freelance. Good thing for a kid your age. How about meat? I'll send you a box of Christmas meat. And then, of course, you've got Rosemary Harris as Aunt May and Cliff Robertson as Uncle Ben. They are really great, in my opinion. I don't know if they're my favorite Aunt May and Uncle Ben. It's a tie between them and Martin Sheen and Sally Field in the Amazing Spider-Man films. But to me, they are excellent in this movie. Uncle Ben is kind and nurturing, and Aunt May is this really nice grandmotherly presence. I mean, I'd say that would be my problem with her, is that she doesn't feel like Peter's mother, like Aunt May kind of does in the comics. But in terms of her being a representation of the Aunt May in the 616 comics, she's perfect. Like, she really nails the role. And then, of course, looking back at this movie and seeing all these famous actors in little side roles, like Elizabeth Banks is Betty Brant, Joe Manganiello is Flash Thompson, heck, even Octavia Spencer is in this movie. Like, she is the lady that signs Peter up to the wrestling match. Like, that is so crazy looking back at this movie and just noticing all these big names now. And of course, with a Spider-Man movie, you expect good action. And the action in this movie is pretty good. I really like it. Some of the CGI does look outdated, but it still looks pretty good. I will say, I'm not a massive fan of the cinematography in this movie. There's something about it that looks a little, I don't know, I wouldn't say corny, but in many ways it does make it feel like it was made in the 90s, which in turn I think doesn't really help the fight scenes, because some of the fight scenes do feel a little bit corny and outdated. Like, in many ways they do look like scenes taken from a Power Rangers episode. But I mean, that being said, I love the brutality of the final fight. I mean, not only is Willem Dafoe chewing up the scenery as the Green Goblin, misery, 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 that's what you've chosen, but the imagery of the scene is pretty much ripped directly from Amazing Spider-Man issue 122, The Goblin's Last Stand. And once again, it's Sam Raimi just, you know, pulling on my comic book roots, tugging my heartstrings, and just adapting things that I love, those 60s and 70s Spider-Man comics, the Death of Gwen Stacy arc, pulling imagery from that and putting that into the film in a respectable and appropriate place. Like, just, God, I love it. And then, of course, you've got Danny Elfman's beautiful score. Not only is it iconic with the Spider-Man theme and the Green Goblin theme and the Mary Jane romance theme, the responsibility theme, like, it's all just wonderful. And honestly, I love the opening credits now. Like, as a kid, they always used to excite me because of the music. Especially when we get to Spider-Man 2 and that iconic Alex Ross painting sequence, like, it's so good. Also, Chad Kroger's hero is iconic. I will hear nothing bad said about it. I love it. And overall, despite my issues and nitpicks I have with Sam Raimi's interpretation of Spider-Man, I love this movie. I think this is the perfect superhero origin film. It's the perfect template. I mean, how many times have you watched a superhero movie and someone will pay homage to this movie? Or you'll be watching a superhero parody and you just see someone taking a scene from the Raimi films and referencing it. That's how iconic and amazing this movie is. It's wonderful. I love the cast, I love the score, I love the action, I love Raimi's heart and dedication to it. Just, this is one of the great superhero movies, and for good reason. It is iconic. But what do you guys think about Sam Raimi's Spider-Man? Let me know in the comments down below. Like, subscribe, follow me on social media, all that good stuff. It's all down in the description. Until we meet again, see you guys next time.